Okay, as we are still having maybe more friends to join us today. So first, welcome everyone to join our workshop on in solidarity with the indigenous people in the United States. Now we're gonna so today the reason why we are having this workshop here today is because this was an inspiration we got from our multicultural counseling class, which has raised our awareness to the indigenous peoples in the United States. And we're here doing this workshop as a social justice intervention to raise the public awareness of this group. And also, we are also very honored to have Dr. Catherine McKinley to join us to give us a more in-depth knowledge on how to be an ally with this group. So maybe I'll introduce three of our presenters today, and also Dr. McKinley. So my name is Nina Lee. I'm a doctoral counseling psychology student at Purdue University. And we also have Viviana here and Stephanie here. We are all doctoral students in the counseling psychology program. And for today's workshop, we're gonna have two sections. The first section will be a presentation that Viviana will give a brief introduction on the Native Indiana history, Native American history of Indiana. And then Stephanie will give us some introduction on the land acknowledgement, on why we should have the land acknowledgement, and what is a land grant university. And next we will have Dr. Catherine McKinley to give us a lecture, and followed by a Q&A session. Now let's welcome Viviana.
All right, so with that, I'll go ahead and get started with the presentation, and let me go ahead and share my screen here. All right, can everyone see my screen okay? Yes. All right, so like Nina introduced the title of our presentation, we will be presenting in solidarity with Indigenous peoples in the United States. And just, as a disclaimer, we are still students, so we are also learners. Many are. So we've already learned so much through putting this presentation together, but we're also very excited to have Dr. McKinley facilitate some of that conversation, with her expertise. So with that, I want to go ahead and briefly start off with history of Native Americans in the United States. So American Indian and Alaska Native make up about 5.4 million people, representing nearly 2% of. They are a highly heterogeneous group. They do consist of 566 distinct tribes, and there's about 170 languages spoken within those tribes. About 26.8 of American Indian and Alaska Native people speak another language other than English in their home. And then also about 22% of American Indians live on reservations. Just to give a brief visual of what it looks like in the United States, this is a map of the nation with the population levels. Specifically to Indiana, there's about 50,000 people of different tribes living in the state. So that's kind of more of a visual for you all to get a brief or general understanding of how it looks like throughout the nation. The name Indiana actually means land of the Indians or land of Indians. Within Indiana, there's a couple different tribes that are significant part of the state, including the Miamis, Chippewa, Delawares, Erie, Shawnee, Iroquois, Kickapoo, Potawatomi. This one always catches me, and I've been trying really hard, so excuse if I butcher it, but it's Potawatomi, there you go. Mohegan, Nanticoke, Huron, and Mohegan. Some of the languages spoken in Indiana, or the tribes of Indiana, are Iroquoian and Algonquian. And to give a brief history of some of the treaties and acts that affected Native American communities. So in 1763, the Treaty of Paris was one that affected the tribes. So this actually ended the French and the Indian War, but it gave all territories to Britain, and so that kind of eased that foreign military presence in the mainland. So I had a brief video as well to show, but due to the time, I'm gonna go ahead and drop it in the Dropbox at the end of or at the end of my the presentation, so that you can have a little bit of a brief overview of the Potawatomi tribe in Indiana. So it's essentially a video that was put together by the Native American Cultural Center here at Purdue, where it was a guest speaker as well that talked a little bit about how he was part of this tribe, and how essentially they were some of the last quote unquote survivors in the state of Indiana because of some of the resistance that they underwent throughout these different treaties, and essentially efforts to remove them from their own land. So I'll go ahead and drop that at the end of our section of the presentation, so that if you have extra time, you can go ahead and have an opportunity to watch that. In 1815, the treaty between the United States of America and the Wyandotte, Delaware, Seneca, Shawanoe, Miami, Chippewa, Ottawa, and Potawatomi tribes of Indians residing within the limits of the state of Ohio and territories of Indiana and Michigan. Essentially, the goal of this treaty was to absolve the Native Americans who supported Great Britain in the War of 1812, and to kind of secure their allegiance to the United States. In 1830, the Indian Removal Act essentially was an effort to move any indigenous people to the west of the Mississippi, and then again to remove the last Potawatomi tribes from Indiana. And then in 1887, Dawes General Allotment Act, passed by Congress, led to the break of the large Indian reservations and the sale of Indian lands to white settlers. So with that, I would like to transition over to Stephanie. She'll be talking a little bit more about land-grant universities, as well as land acknowledgements for the last portion of our presentation.
Great. And so you'll move my slides for me, Viviana, if you don't mind. Okay, so Purdue being a land-grant university, we wanted to kind of provide an overview of the history of land-grant universities and our responsibility as one, not only to the public, but specifically to the indigenous people that were forcibly removed from their land as a result of these land-grant universities. So I just wanted to start with the Morrill Act of 1862, which was the first of its kind, was instituted by the Lincoln administration. And here, through this act, institutions were designated by state legislature or Congress to receive benefits. So essentially, the federal government provided land to states to their to sell and use the proceeds of these the selling of the federal lands to establish institutions. And so the original mission of these institutions were to primarily teach agriculture, military tactics, and the mechanic arts. And it was referred to as the People's College, right? And through these acts, there's been over 100 land-grant universities. Purdue is the only one in Indiana. Next slide. So throughout these land grants, over 10 million acres of land was essentially sold throughout the West. I just want to emphasize that this land was and continues to still be indigenous. This land was colonized land via white settlement. And so thereby, and therein lies our responsibility, even so, as a land-grant university with these goals of serving the people, right? We weren't necessarily intended to serve all people. It was a specific kind of people, and it was to bolster the education and the economic mobility of white settlers at that time. Okay, so agriculture in itself, as one of the purposes for these land-grant universities, or to promote agriculture, is in itself a potent symbol of Southern colonialism, which the Land Grant Act reflects by promoting A, Western migration, B, education for the promotion of Western dominant values, and C, agricultural education as a settler colonial identity, right? And with that, a lot of the agricultural traditions were not indigenous, right? So again, educating students in this very white colonialist framework and cultural perspective and lens. Although land-grant institutions expanded higher education opportunities for certain individuals, just wanted to emphasize that it also promoted settlement of white colonialism. So to our right, we'll see the beneficiaries of Missouri land. So throughout these several states, we see how many acres of land was taken from indigenous peoples, right? So the way we can challenge the traditional notion of land-grant universities is through land acknowledgement statements. And I'll talk about the importance of land acknowledgement statements. It's a simple act of disruption, but it's meant to be a catalyst for more conversation and consciousness raising. And it's also about reverence and respect for the people of this land. So it's a way to provoke conversation, and it's a very critical public intervention that we can use in our email signatures or in our publications, right? And just create visibility or expand visibility about the people that continue to inhabit or the legacy of the indigenous people on the land that we inhabit currently, right? So next slide. Again, as I mentioned, land acknowledgement statements act as public interventions. Very simple, but impactful, potentially. So just one definition that I wanted to include here is a land acknowledgement is a formal statement that recognizes the unique and enduring relationship that exists between indigenous peoples and their traditional territories. And so I just wanted to note that there's no formula necessarily for land acknowledgement, but there are recommendations for how to draw an original one or how to borrow. Usually it's localized, right? So here at Purdue, we want to honor the local indigenous peoples and kind of personalize and localize our land acknowledgement. And so I'm just going to offer some examples and kind of like what features make them land acknowledgements, or kind of conceptualize them. So the first is right here through the University of Alberta. The University of Alberta offers this explanation of acknowledgement. To acknowledge the traditional territory is to recognize its longer history, reaching beyond colonialism and the establishment of European colonies, as well as its significance for indigenous peoples who lived and continue to live upon this territory, and whose practices and spiritualities were tied to the land and continue to develop in relationship to the land and its other inhabitants today. So here at Purdue, through our Native American Educational Cultural Center, or the NAECC, they have their own land acknowledgement, again, localizing the connection and our proximity to this particular land. So the NAECC acknowledges the traditional homelands of the woodland people, which Purdue University is built upon, and we honor and appreciate the Potawatomi, Lenape, Miami, and Shawnee people who are the indigenous caretakers of this land. So some can be very simple and just acknowledge and pay homage and respect to the peoples and who currently inhabit and have inhabited for thousands of years this particular land. And I just want to bring attention to another example from a current faculty at Purdue, Dr. Zanotti, who goes a little further than that by not only acknowledging all of the indigenous people who have inhabited Indiana since as far back as we know, it also acknowledges people whose footprint we no longer have in Indiana because of genocide and because of forced migration to other lands or to other territories in the United States. And also there's a direct acknowledgement for our localized traditions. So I just want to skip over to the sentence that begins with, "These lands continue to carry the stories of these nations, their forced removal, and their struggles for survival and recognition. As scholars, we have a responsibility to acknowledge both the peoples as well as the histories of disposition that have allowed for the growth of these institutions. By reflecting on these histories, we hope to actively address the role that our universities have played in shaping them. I also recognize Purdue University is located near Prophetstown State Park in the Tippecanoe battlefield, two historic areas where indigenous leaders Tecumseh and Tensawatawa, sorry, I apologize, took an important stand during colonialization, uniting Native peoples in the region. So again, this particular land acknowledgement acknowledges just the violence and the history of resistance that's native to Indiana as well, and this county as in particular. So without further ado, I actually wanted to just say a couple pieces, maybe 5 quick notes on that acknowledgement before we move on into our speaker. One, that it ought to start with our self-reflection, right? This is not for our absolving of any guilt. It's about continuing the conversation and really being inclusive. It includes doing our homework. I still stumbled through some pronunciations, so I charge myself with also really including these names into my everyday lexicon. So I charge myself publicly to also learn and memorize and know by heart these names. And I will continue to challenge myself to that, using appropriate language, and not to talk about Native American people as past or ancient relics. They're very much still part of our land. Using how we use our tense is also important. And of course, although there's a tragic, bloody, and violent history with our treatment of Native American peoples, our land acknowledgements shouldn't be grim on its own, recognizing the violence and not downplaying what happened, but also speaking to the resistance of these people as well, and their cultural legacies is really important. So with that, now I will finally turn it over to our speaker, Dr. Catherine McKinley, who will present us with this lecture.
Thank you for Viviana and Stephanie to give us a brief introduction on the history and land acknowledgement. So before Dr. McKinley giving us the lecture, I would like to give a brief introduction on Dr. McKinley. So Dr. Catherine McKinley is an associate professor at the Tulane University School of Social Work after having attained her PhD in 2013 in social work from the University of Iowa. Dr. McKinley has worked with indigenous tribes cross-nationally for over 10 years and works on federally funded community engaged research to develop and test culturally grounded interventions to promote family resilience and transcendence while addressing violence, substance abuse, and associated health disparities, including diabetes and health. Dr. McKinley serves as a principal investigator of Chuka Ochafi Natana, which is in Choctaw, and it means the Weaving Healthy Family Program to promote wellness and resilience and prevent alcohol and other drug abuse and violence, with a supplement focusing on the secondary health effect of COVID-19, promoting access, sustainability, and engagement with a digital assisted intervention through the use of SMS text messages. Her work may be found in 70 peer-reviewed publications and in collaboration with tribes, led to the development of the indigenous-based and ecological framework of historical oppression, resilience, and transcendence, which identifies culturally relevant risk and protective factors related to wellness across community, family, and individual levels from a relational perspective. This framework was chosen for inclusion in the edited book, Grand Challenges for Society, Evidence-Based Social Work Practice. And her work has also been highlighted as best paper by the Journal of Ethnic and Cultural Diversity in Social Work in 2018. Indigenous Women and Professionals' Proposed Solution to Prevent Intimate Partner Violence in Tribal Communities. As a lead editor on a special issue, an associated book entitled Mental, Physical, and Social Dimensions of Health Equity and Wellness Among U.S. Indigenous People, What is Known and Next Steps. She is a leader conducting community engaged and culturally grounded health equity research. So now let's welcome Dr. McKinley.
Thank you for that introduction, and thank you all for doing this work. I think you're already demonstrating many of the steps of working in solidarity with Indigenous peoples by committing to learning about, becoming educated about the local tribes of the region and the history of that. So that's really to be commended, and so wonderful to see that you're initiating this. I can share my screen here. Okay. View here. Let's see, are you seeing the double one right now, or are you seeing just the screen?
We see the presenter view.
What's that? Can you see the note slide and all that?
Yes.
Okay. Let me see if I can change the view here. All right. Is that better? Can you just see the slide now?
Yeah, we can.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. Just want to make sure. All right. What's that?
With the thumbnails, if that's, you don't mind that, we don't.
Oh, no, I'm sorry. There's two screens and I think it's going on the, I'm not sure what it's doing here. So let me just do a different, I'll try again here.
I think if you just,
I'll do this.
Yeah.
Is that better?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. All right. I might be looking to the side here, but so thanks again for the introduction. I don't need to repeat kind of the title here, but go ahead and get into it here. Okay, just want to acknowledge the funding sources kind of for the work that I'm going to be sharing with you, the case example, which is different NIH awards that have led to the current study that I'll tell you about towards the end of the presentation. And I also want to, I'm going to kind of breeze through this a little bit so we do have time for questions. So just also want to acknowledge the contributors, the Choctaw and the All Nations Health Center tribal partners who adapted the intervention that I'm going to be telling you about today, as well as my colleagues and mentors and collaborators. And you did a wonderful job talking about land acknowledgements. And I have my own as well that acknowledges the Indigenous peoples of the New Orleans area as well as Mississippi, where I work. And so acknowledging a lot of the state recognized tribes as well as federally recognized tribes, as well as those who are not recognized by either of those jurisdictions due to historical oppression, and those no longer with us due to genocide. But I really appreciate your presentation on the land acknowledgements. Thank you for that. And so to start off with, I'm going to talk about the framework that was introduced in the bio, the framework of historical oppression, resilience, and transcendence, which is a tribal-based framework that we use to situate this work, and also the importance of trust building and some of the health inequities that might bring some of the Indigenous peoples into your clinical practice, if that's what you end up doing, or academic work that can place Indigenous peoples in our care. So I'm on my sabbatical right now. I'm actually working on a book, and I love this kind of ethics of love and ethics of care by some Indigenous feminists and Black feminists that I have followed. But one of the most prominent themes, I've talked to about, like over 500 Indigenous peoples and done a lot of life history interviews. And one of the themes that I just love the best is elders talking about how we take care of each other. That's what we do in our Indigenous communities. And I think that's just something that we can think about in working with any peoples is, we take care of each other. When we see someone hurting, we take care of them. And we can see in the world that's not happening in so many ways, and it's heartbreaking. But this kind of ethics of love and just commitment and responsibility to take care for each other. And that's an Indigenous theme that came out in the work that I've done. And I just really love that. It's also a theme that's come out by ethicists and that I think is important. Like Paulo Freire is a philosopher and theorist that I base the framework of historical oppression, resilience, and transcendence. So I'm just going to call it FORT from now on. And he says that dialogue cannot exist in the absence of profound love for the world and its people. And so this has to be based on, reciprocity, relationships, and trust, and humanity, right? Emancipation and empowerment requires caring for each other, along with reciprocity, equity, decolonize, uncorrupt love. And by that, I mean, we are not each other's possessions or commodities. We have to value the humanity in people. And Indigenous feminists, Lindsay Nixon, and Black feminist Bell Hooks talks about ethical love is grounded in the responsibilities to communities and love for all our relations, including families, extended families, along with our relations who come from different ethnic and cultural backgrounds. Indeed, ethical love requires us to be in good relation and responsible to each other. So I just wanted to start off with this, it's deep, it's internal, it's an internal commitment to working in a good way. Okay, and so based on a lot of working with people who have been marginalized over time requires trust. And it's important to know, as potential either clinicians or people who work with Indigenous peoples, that baseline of trust and working with any marginalized groups is undermined, has been undermined through centuries of exploitation and harm. And so when we work with people, sometimes clinicians might talk about resistance or all of these things. That's not really resistance. It's actually real experiences of harm and exploitation and manipulation with dominant groups. And so even if we personally have not harmed, people, we represent the people who have done that. And so, frankly, as a person who's done research, there's something called drive-by research where people kind of, come in, take the information and take it out and use it for their career building, but not actually provide benefit to communities. And so, there's a reason for this distrust. I mean, it's not based on nothing. And so we're coming in with a baseline of trust that has been undermined. And so it's our job to build that trust. It's on us, even if we personally did not harm people in the past. And so just to understand that a lot of these strategies are to remove some of the risk, the inherent risk that people of marginalized groups have when they're coming into relationships where there are power differentials. And that includes as a clinician, researcher, or professional. And so a lot of these are built on around trust building. So it's important to integrate time to build relationships with Indigenous community members. And that sometimes means going and spending time with Indigenous communities outside of work, like going to a powwow, going to a community celebration, showing that you're committed beyond just this specific relationship that you have with them will really work to garner some trust. And being transparent and authentic, that balances the power in that, like, this is what I have to work with. These are the resources. This is what I'm going to do. You know, if you're at a doctor's appointment and they're telling you exactly, being transparent about what's going on, that's good practice, right? And as clinicians and researchers and professionals, we can also be transparent about what we have to work with. We're not keeping secrets. We're not holding the power, okay? And then also share in the decision-making. So actually provide, we use a community advisory board of 11 Indigenous peoples who have, and then another 10 in another group in another tribe who have adapted the intervention I'm going to share with you. So they make decisions, and they also, they steer where we're going in this work. So people know, Indigenous people know what they need, but we just need to listen to them and allow their voice to really direct how we work with them. And then also committing long-term. So this is not something, if you really can't commit long-term or in a meaningful way, I kind of recognize, I think it's important to become educated, but be careful about entering into these things because there's a history of people coming in and leaving, and that's part of the distrust. And so I wouldn't enter into these relationships without really thinking about this and being committed that you can carry out and see things through. I talk about working for 10 years and there's an Indigenous person that's on the community advisory board. She's like, you know, I never know if I didn't know if you'd ever like do something, but it turns out you have. You know, it just took a long time for us to gather the information and then turn it into an intervention that, you know, they want. But I stuck through it, and it's 10 years and we got the funding and we're doing it. But I was committed to seeing it through and seeing, like, using information to inform something that can actually benefit the community. And so I would really recommend, if you're doing this, be careful, and also make sure that you can commit and be good on your commitments. So this is, I know, a big table, and I'm not going to go through these other than this is more of a preview. So I'm going to share these with you and then kind of talk about how I've applied these in the work that I've done. But just for a quick preview, prior to doing any work with Indigenous peoples, because I'm a white woman and I didn't know whether I should do this and how to do this in a good way. So I really didn't know, and I did research on that. So I actually talked to 13 Indigenous and non-Indigenous researchers who from Hawaii and from the US, and they have like an average of 20 years of experiences. And so in doing that, I inadvertently found these strategies of toolkits, and it turned out it is okay and good for me to do this work in a intentional way with cultural humility and trying to forward, you know, Indigenous leaders. And so as a white woman, I try to provide access to spaces of leadership for Indigenous peoples. But from that, I think these strategies are really helpful. And I have to say that the successes that you heard in the bio really are credit to following these strategies. I mean, no joke. I just have done these and they work. And, you know, they come from Indigenous and non-Indigenous ancestors, of scholarly ancestors. So I give credit to them who provided these. But what you had done in the first section of this workshop, you know, becoming educated, and then beyond what's written, you know, trying to listen, sit at the feet of Indigenous people. As we know, with any person who has been marginalized, you know, abuse survivors or whatever it is, they have the answers. They know the solutions. You need to listen to them. And I remember when I did my dissertation, I shared the results with a cultural insider that I'd been working with. And he kind of like laid out my results before I had. And I'm like, well, why did I do this work? You already know it. And he's like, well, they won't listen to me. Their tribal leaders wouldn't listen to him as a tribal member. And there can be internalized oppression. And then leaders, like if we're talking about Congress, white leaders, white male, you know, these leaders also may listen more to people that are closer to their sociodemographic background. That is not okay, but it might be true. And so it's a way we can leverage privileges that we might have to advocate for the tribe. And so working with cultural insiders is so important. Getting invited and having a positive reputation is critical. That's why, you know, don't do things you say, do not commit to things you cannot do, right? Because we have this baseline of distrust that we need to offset. And so not only are you, you know, building a reputation for yourself, but anyone who is like you in your own positionality as a whatever demographic you represent. So I'm representing any researcher that might come into this community, for instance. having cultural humility, like I do not have the answers. The reason why the things have been successful is because I've listened to others and, showcase their voices. None of these are my ideas, really. They're just showcasing the voices of the people who do know. Being transparent about my resources, spending time, like I mentioned, going to community celebrations, kind of getting to know the norms and the practices, the long-term commitment. A lot of times these communities might be farther, like we might have to travel, and the community we work with are about 4 hours away. And so I go and stay there. I had my 8-month-old with me on my dissertation. We lived, around those communities. It takes more than just, 8 to 5 a lot of times. And then having patience and fluidity and flexibility. If a community member dies, if something gets a health problem, these things can interfere with the normal, like I said, 8 to 5 schedule, and not enabling for fluidity and flexibility. The needs of your individual client or community, they're going to differ. And also people differ about the extent to which they're engaged with their culture and traditions. And there's nothing wrong or right about that. That's just the way it is. And so you really have to have self-determination and consent when it comes to working with people. Follow their lead. And some people are more and less comfortable with more mainstream types of services versus more traditional ones. And so you really have to follow their lead. The people I work with come from the deep South, kind of a lot of Christianity and that kind of thing. And so, that's not for me to make decisions about. I just follow and work within and work with, in whatever that means for them. This takes time. I said I allowed for a whole year kind of to go ahead with the tribe before I actually worked with them. I actually did it, introductions. I went and just introduced myself and hung out. So if you can enable that time for building relationships, that's really wonderful. Using a tribal perspective, investing resources. So I have an NIH grant. It's a big grant, and over half of it goes directly to tribal people. Whether it comes to, we pay tribal members to cook our meals, because it's the family meals we do. And we're hiring the tribal members to facilitate the program. And all of these things, if you can develop and devote infrastructure and resources to the tribes themselves, that's wonderful. And then with this, we're also training tribal leaders then, so that when the grant leaves, then we have these leaders and professionals who can carry on this work beyond that. And then also reciprocate and give back and advocate at higher leaders. So I've advocated for the National Congress of American Indians. So I've used this work and informed that, which is the conduit from Congress. So they kind of state resolutions that go to Congress. And so that's one way I can use my privilege to inform Congress and in policies that might be made. Another, I'm starting to be involved in the National Academy of the Sciences on the Committee for Resilience in Communities. And so in that way, I can use my position to center Indigenous concerns. And that's what I've been doing, just like you have in this workshop. So just really touch upon quickly this framework that was developed with Indigenous peoples on violence against women originally. It's an ecological framework looking at risk and protective factors. Oops, yeah, you do see it, okay. Across multiple levels. And so at the societal level, historical oppression is one of those key factors that structurally determines a lot of the health outcomes that we care about as practitioners. But risk factors, those that exacerbate problems, protective factors that buffer against problems or promote positive outcomes, as well as promotive factors, which are strengths regardless of whether there are adversity. Those things we look at how they intersect and overlap across these ecological levels. And that predicts whether someone has wellness. And so this wellness wheel is kind of a rendition of the medicine wheel, which is a relational framework, which is Indigenous kind of in the framing of that. And it incorporates spiritual, mental, physical, emotional, and I add social and environmental aspects of living. Within those dimensions of the wellness, such as mental, you might look at depression outcomes, or physical, you might look at cardiovascular health. But we frame it, we center it more of in a relational worldview, such as Indigenous peoples would. So this is an example of using a tribal perspective, and I have Paulo Freire up there because a lot of the concepts of internalized oppression come from his work. But historical oppression is a concept that incorporates not only historical traumas, such as the boarding schools that people have talked about, forced relocation, genocide, but it also incorporates the contemporary, the current forms of oppression, such as environmental injustices, violence against women, economic inequalities. So discrimination, all of the things that are still happening that drive a lot of our problems that we see just as much as historical factors. So it incorporates the past and the present, forms of oppression that are still happening. An example, and these things that were initially externally imposed through colonization have over time been internalized and embodied sometimes in communities. And so that's why we might see greater rates of violence within families and communities, because if they were taken to boarding schools and socialized in the Western way and forced assimilation and Christianization, they were taken away from their own family's abilities to socialize them. And so that will cause them to strike out at each other at times through horizontal violence and oppression, sub-oppression. So it kind of explains why hurt people sometimes. And so an example of this is the violence against women is highest for Indigenous people of any group. And why would that be, given that most Indigenous communities held women as like matrilocal or matriarchies? It was more female-centered. The deities, the gods were women. And so for this to be reversed in such a way is really a compelling question of why has this happened? And I would argue that it's this historical oppression has introduced patriarchal gender roles, which has been internalized, but also externally, perpetrated upon Indigenous women. And so they have reversed some of these pro-social or positive types of roles that were protective for women. And so that's one of the really interesting aspects of looking at this work. Despite having historical oppression, people talked about resilience and resistance from historical oppression. They have not been, passive recipients of oppression. They've demonstrated survivance, which is an Indigenous concept of ingenuity, persistence, and commitment to place, humor, and spirit. So that's an Indigenous-based framework. In the work that I've done, I found some Indigenous focused, culturally relevant protective factors. And before I go into those, I actually think that gender relationships, again, that's one of them. The gender relationships that are really very pervasive prior to colonization are protective. So they were more complementary versus adversarial. And although there was a delegation of tasks between the sexes, it was not devalued. Women's work was not devalued, and women's work held high status and respect. But also people, a lot of Indigenous communities held gender non-conforming people in high regard as like spiritual. So if there's the two-spirit Indigenous peoples, and two-spirit Indigenous peoples really represents the capacity to work across the roles of the different genders, but also to see broader perspectives, like as a bird's eye view of all the gender, kind of dynamics. So transcendent kind of gender norms, right? And so instead of devaluing and oppressing people who are gender nonconforming, they actually held up, and it was the same was true for people with disabilities. And so there's some really beautiful demonstrations that we can learn from as a broader group, where people are trying to get back to, like environmental justice as well. The extended family and family kinship bonds are very strong, right? And so despite formal services may not provide some of the quality of care as other groups, the extended family and family are just strong. And also the connections to place, subsistence, or living off the land and foodways, these are all really protective factors that not only promote activity and health, but psychological health. So being in nature and being on the land promotes the sense of awe, a focus, a flow that we talk about for wellness. And so this is naturally built into a lot of the Indigenous life ways. And so it's still happening in many communities. Also just the cultural traditions. So, being involved in your cultural traditions and engaging in those has been found to be protective against not only physical health, but mental health. And so traditions are not a monolith. Some tradition can be oppressive to women under the guise of tradition. So we can't accept these things without questioning them and making sure that they are emancipatory for all. But in general, working, being involved in traditions and in dance and drumming and, the different tribal-based traditions can be really protective for people, as well as the centrality of faith, spirituality, and cultural healing. So these are things that came out of women and Indigenous peoples' themes. So despite having resisted these historical oppressions for 5 centuries, of course, there are effects of historical oppression. And so I'm going to look at the time here, and I might speed through some of this because I want to make sure we have time for questions. I want to talk about real quickly how we developed an intervention for substance abuse prevention and violence prevention while promoting health and wellness. And I'm not going to go through the details of that too much, except that some of the tools that I talked to you about are demonstrated through this, and that it was 10 years of work. And that was really spent, learning about what are the risk and protective factors in the general population, and then applying that to Indigenous peoples in the groups that we're working with. And so I followed a process of cultural adaptation with the tribes that has been set for culturally adapting interventions, have reported on the results with the tribes on over 15 occasions. So these are these are things that you might do, right? If you're trying to work with Indigenous populations, working with insiders and collaboration, this whole process has been in communion with a community advisory board. And again, this is just kind of another representation of, the studies that have kind of given rise to the current intervention. And all of that took, getting invited, demonstrating patience, going the distance, investing resources. And so all of that really led to the ability to do this work. In terms of what has happened as a result of historical oppression, I'll quickly touch upon this, realizing that we're having some time restrictions, but looking at kind of outcomes and inequities that might bring Indigenous peoples in for care. First of all, physical health inequities. So the death rates for Indigenous people, again, on average, so it really does differ depending on the context, are on average 50% higher than non-Hispanic whites. Also, disabilities are higher, and life expectancy can be up to 5.5 years lower. And then the mortality is related to accidents, diabetes, alcohol cirrhosis, and liver disease, which are between 2 to almost 7 times higher for Indigenous peoples. These things are interrelated, and so depression and post-traumatic stress disorder, anxiety, alcohol and other drug abuse, violence, these are all risks for some of these causes of mortality, like cardiovascular disease. So a lot of times if you're working with Indigenous peoples and other groups too, I mean, you might hear people talk about chronic health problems, and those are important. It's important, like if you're physically feeling bad, it's going to affect your mental health. So if you're working on mental health, it's important to take more of a holistic approach and understand, how can we also promote some of the, coping or risk factors of those physical health problems. Also, the rates of, I'm not going to go specifically into the figures I have here, so we can get through this, but just the income, the poverty rate is higher than any other ethnic group, as well as the employment inequities, educational inequities, and incarceration rates. So that's higher than any group. And so again, I see these as structural causes based on historical oppression and how that has affected these populations. I just want to connect the educational attainment to historical oppression. Specifically, we talked about boarding schools. It's also true that Native people are less likely to have an associate's degree or bachelor's degree. And interesting that in the Jim Crow Deep South, where I'm located, there were schools for during segregation, there were schools for African Americans and whites, but there were no schools for Indigenous peoples. And so the only way they could have gotten schools is if the missionaries had provided them. And so in those missionary schools of the groups I've worked with, they were usually taught by high schoolers, and they might have gone up to the 1st or 2nd grade. And so they had poor quality education, or they might have had missionary, tribal specific only. And so there was literally no access to formal public education up until desegregation happened. And so you can see that even, there's the boarding school eras, but even into relatively present era, there's been vast educational discrimination that affects the current population. And so you can see why some of these historical and, not too long ago, history here has affected the current educational attainment for a lot of Indigenous peoples. Again, violence against women is about twice that of non-natives. And the consequences of violence are the same health disparities that we see, such as substance abuse and violence, PTSD, depression. I'm not going to go into this, but you can see that so many of these outcomes are just elevated for Indigenous peoples. And I do see these as a result of structural oppression over centuries. So what have we done about this? So one of the things that we worked on developing is this Weaving Healthy Families program. And this is a family-based program. It's a cognitive behavioral psychoeducational program that focuses on substance abuse. It focuses on promoting protective factors like communication, anger management, emotional expression, and decision-making. Each session begins with a meal, and we integrate a talking circle into each session as the form of egalitarian communication. Everyone has a chance to talk, they speak from their heart, there's no interruptions, and it's a way of kind of modeling positive communication, which then can be taken home. And each person or family gets a kit, a smudging kit that we use to use that with the family for their talking circles. So again, it starts with a family meal, and we integrate tribal nutrition into that meal. So there's like a My Plate thing that people use in the general population. There's a tribal version of that integrates like tribal foods. But in these family meals, we teach some on tribal foods and healthy tribal foods. It also we use 10 sessions, and it's called Insights for Living, where they learn on a specific topic, whether it be communication or substance abuse. And then they come back together for their family time and kind of do fun activities to reinforce the teachings that we learned in that session. And you can see we read the Sacred Tree, which is kind of a tribal way of talking about wellness. The last session, we had a celebration session, and you can see a drumming group from the Community Advisory Board that facilitated the session. And here's the Community Advisory Board that adapted this program to demonstrate kind of investment in the community that I talked about, like as a toolkit. We use a community-based participatory research approach. We provide stipends for family to offset economic inequities and provide some direct, assistance, but also, value them for the time that they provide in this. And then this is facilitated by tribal members and provides them training and professional development opportunities. So several people have gotten their higher education degrees. One is finishing her doctorate. There's been a lot of professional development in this program of the people that have been involved. Just to talk about the changes that we made to the original program, we've decreased the sessions to 10 sessions from 16 in kind of the age groups, and we've just streamlined it and made it more simple. And so these are some of the changes that we've made, and have integrated tribal meals, tribal talking circles, and tribal kind of family time. And so again, we provide the immediate income for families, but also scale building for families, and then creating leaders for social change in the form of training community members to facilitate the program. So I wanted to share a few quotes from tribal members who facilitate the program about how this program has affected them. One person said, they like this program and their development in it because it's based on our culture and our history. Nothing can heal us like our own people who have been through the problems that we present. We have a shared history and have a better understanding of what is needed to help the family heal. Another person said, I love that we took the time to base it on our tribal beliefs, how our families operate. It has changed the way I look at addiction and has helped me to find better ways to help those struggling. It has also helped me with my spiritual understanding and brought me peace. Another person said, being part of the Weaving Healthy Families program has helped me help tribal families. It's been empowering. It has meant that I have a direct and positive impact between intervention and outcomes for our community members. It is our program for our community and gives us a chance to see what can happen when we give 100% and are supported. So just a couple of quotes that the Community Advisory Board has mentioned. I want to just give you a few results of, we did a pilot. And so just to tell you what this program has led to some positive outcomes. And then we're testing this in a larger group. But it incorporates these, showed you that wellness wheel and the risk and protective factors. It incorporates what we found in the preliminary research into this intervention. And those factors are cultural, community, family, and individual factors that we've integrated into the intervention. So I know this is a big slide. You don't have to understand all of this, but I just want to say at these ecological levels, we have community, familial, relational, and individual levels. We also assessed outcomes at each of those levels, and we found positive change even with the only eight families that we had enroll in the pilot. We're now testing this with 175 families in that process. And then we found that community resilience or community mastery increased significantly from pre to post, as well as social support, family resilience and resilience, the family environment, violence against intimate partner violence decreased, as well as the ability to negotiate without violence increased. People were able to emotionally regulate better, as well as lower depressive symptoms, and their health-related quality of life increased, as well as their consumption of sugar sweetened beverages, which is a precursor to diabetes. So we found some great results, and this was developed, I think, because, you know, with the tribal determination of how we integrated a lot of the aspects of it. So again, now we're testing this with 175 families and with SMS text messaging integrated. And we're going to look at the sustainability so that this can be implemented with other tribal groups. So I know that we're kind of running out of time, so I'm going to finish this up. And I hope that some of this led to understanding of how like direct experiences led to impactful research, and that, you know, developing community leaders is really an important aspect of our work that we do, as well as commitment to diversity and inclusion, and particularly working in a good way of Indigenous research methodologies. So that is my presentations, and I'm going to open it up if we have time for questions.
Thank you very much, Dr. McKinley, for this very informative lecture. We have learned a lot. You helped us to understand how to get it right, and how to do it right with Indigenous people. As there are not very much time left, I guess we're all wondering about one question, is that can you tell us about maybe one time you or your colleague or someone in your research team that once has done something wrong, and like what happened at that moment, and how did you choose to move forward after that happened?
So a time someone has done something, like if we make a mistake or error.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, I think that is why, you know, the relationship building is so important. I don't know, like, I can't think of a time that really was too glaring. I think partly because a lot of the work that we do is based on relationships, and that we already have a relationship. So if something happens, it's not perceived as kind of like an outsider, you know, oppressive type of thing as much. But I do want to say, like, one of the things that happen with if you're not socialized into the same worldview of the people that you're working with, is that sometimes we may not see or highlight the same things that the people that we're working with do. And I can I will give you a personal example of that. When I was doing the work on research, in one of my elders, Emily, you know, was talking about how research is spiritual. And I was socialized as an academic, never talk about spirituality in academics. And so I was kind of like saying it made meaning, or, you know, I was kind of like washing it down a little bit because I was socialized as a Western, you know, academic not to talk about spirituality. And so even as a woman, I probably oppressed that in myself, right? So it's a gendered thing, right? We don't talk about anything soft, you know, because I've been socialized into a male gendered academic, you know, academy. And so she's like, no, it's spiritual. And I'm like, thank you. So, and we put that, you know, I try to use the words of participants in the themes. And so I think it's been important for me to notice when they're kind of repeating things, and I'm like, wait, I'm not, you know, my colonization has kept me from seeing this. And so I think that's like early settlers, when they came, they just didn't remark on certain things because they just didn't see it. I mean, and so I think, I'm sure you've either experienced that or have, you know, maybe done that, where if you're not socialized and familiar with the way people are and think, then we might miss things. And I think, or make it invisible or push it down. And so I think that's why it's so important to listen and be like, if people are bringing that up, there's a reason, you know, and to really center that rather than kind of dismiss it. And so there's this thing with like alternative therapies in medicine where doctors don't ask about it. And so it's happening with a lot of groups, but it's not being asked about. And some of those things may be contradictory with Western medicine, but because doctors aren't trained to look or ask for that, they're not seeing it. And so there's actually some severe implications of that if they're not really paying attention.
Thank you, Dr. McKinley. I don't know if you have extra time to stay for maybe one or two.
Yeah, I'm fine
more
for
questions.
if people have other questions. Sure.
Okay. So there is actually one follow-up questions in terms of the last one. So we are also wondering, how did you assemble your advisory council or like those tribal members in the communities?
Sure.
What was the selection process for the CVPR research?
Yeah, I think that's again, it really, like I didn't know this either. This is emerging as we were talking, but it really is relationships. So like I had done work with Indigenous peoples. I kind of listened to professionals and women who experienced violence, talked to over 400 people. So I knew a lot of people, and I knew people and so what we did was we wanted to have people who work with families and who would have the expertise to kind of do the, the intervention itself. And so I contacted people who represented different kind of stakeholders in the community. So like we have a person that's on the police force, he's also the coroner, and he's also a cultural insider. He's like he does all the things. And then we have a couple elders / cultural experts. And so they can facilitate talking circles and things like that. We have people from mental health. So I try to get people from behavioral and mental health. I try to get people from social services and family services. And so we kind of identified the kind of key providers that would do this type of work so that we have sustainability after. So like after we test this, we want to house this in the community agencies. And so we wanted to make sure that we include kind of the stakeholders in those agencies. And most of them had all worked with me already. And so we had relationships and they stuck with it the whole time. So they've been involved like basically the whole 10 years that I've worked with the tribe. So you kind of choose what entities or stakeholders make sense. And then hopefully you have relationships. And if you don't, work with a cultural insider who can be like, who's a good person for this? And make sure they're trustworthy though, right?
It sounds like trust is always a very important, like a key element in all this work.
It is, yeah. And just to realize that distrust comes from experience, not from nowhere, right? And so it's really the onus is on us, right, to build that and to understand if people act in funny ways towards us, as there's a reason. It might not be direct experience with us in the past, but it's probably direct experience with someone that looks and sounds like us. And that's our job to build that.
Thank you. I also saw Maple who opened your camera. Do you have a question to ask? Okay.
Maple's actually, she's works with me on the Weaving Healthy Families program. Yeah.
That's cool. Hi, thanks for joining us.
She's doing a lot of that, so.
So I had actually typed in a question in the chat box. But I guess I can just chime in. So I actually was thinking about this as you were talking about like research. I know that you have a grant and that, I think can be beneficial in many ways. But in terms of like when you don't have necessarily the funding, how do you go about compensating the communities that you're working with? Because I think there's always this thing of like you said, like not coming in to harm these communities. So I think to a certain extent, compensating them at a, to a certain level, I think is fair. So I guess my question is like, how do you go about compensating them when you don't have the funding?
Yeah, so I do think like working with marginalized communities, we do have a little bit more of a responsibility to kind of get funding. I mean, and so when I was a student, I was like, I had done this research, and I don't think I compensated the researchers that I first interviewed, but I'm like, I have to give back. Okay, so like I have to get funding. So as a student, as a PhD student, I like just had to be kind of ahead of the game and keep on applying for funding. I do know, like I've had a student who did cover it until she did get it, but like she didn't get it in time. And so I hate to say that, but I think you kind of have to try to get some, like try to apply. And yeah, I don't know what else to say. Like I just, you kind of have to work harder to do this work and more upfront to do it in time. It's tricky. It's weird because it's slow. It's a slow process, but like in some ways you have to be more preemptive on your end Yeah, I mean, I don't think, I mean, I'm sure people do it without compensation. I just never have. But I mean, there's small funding pots. You don't need that much. I mean, if you do a qualitative study, if you have 30 people and it's $10, I mean, you know, I do more than that, but you know, like even that's not that very much. So even providing meals, like providing, you know, meals go a long way too. So like if you can hold meals or do it in kind of a more relational framework and stuff, that might be enough too, to get people to come and stuff. So.
Yeah, I actually have a question as well. I really appreciate you just emphasizing get money, get money. Yeah, just really appreciate that, because even if we can't at all levels of our research, we can still not forego that as a goal. And so I see that it seems that you're trying to scale up the success of your pilot. So congratulations on the success that we were able to see through the research outcomes. And so I'm wondering if there has been like a moment of celebration or big impact that you can point towards and say, okay, I see why I continue to do this. I see how it all came together for this reason.
Yeah, I mean, so this R01 is in the NIH has been after applying like 3 or 4 times. So, you know, just it has been like for the tribe, they've been patient with me too, because I mean, I've had small pockets of funding that I've gotten together. And, you know, we have been, you know, they've been patient with me too. And as a, you know, that's kind of what I can provide. But so those were huge, you know, to get those like, yes, we can finally do it. But I don't know. I really do feel like it's the time where like I've been accepted, and like it's the times when Indigenous people that I work with, you know, say yes, and they keep coming. You know, like it's more like for me, the most fulfilling parts, the most important acceptance or recognition for me is from the tribe. And so like I got, you know, like one of the tribes I work with gave me like, you know, an award, Advocate of the Year award. And so I center my commitment to the communities, and academics and all that, they follow, right? But like personally, they just don't matter as much to me, even though I've still gotten those things, because when you do good work, you will become, you know, you will be compensated, or you will get recognition. But like, I don't seek that. I seek, you know, communion, you know, with the communities. And so I think, yeah, I mean, I can't speak to one, but like, I think when we were able to do this work, we got together, the community advisory board, and they keep coming back. I mean, I'm always so amazed that we get to work together all this time. They've never, like really none of them have left, and that's amazing. So I think that's really, is really reinforcing.
Thank you for that.
Yeah.
Thank you again, Dr. McKinley, for joining our conversation today and giving us so informative lectures. And we all have learned a lot, as no matter as a researcher or a future clinicians. Thanks again.
Thank you. If anyone has anything I can support you in, please let me know. I'm open to anyone, and particularly you know, dedicated to women leaders and all these things. And so please don't hesitate to reach out personally to me, and I'm happy to support you in any way that would be good for you in your career. So
Appreciate it.
All right. Good luck, everyone. Okay. Thank you. Thanks for doing this work. Amazing job. Really great. You guys are the biggest heroes here. Biggest heroes.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay. Bye.